Since the early 1980s, throughout the world, hundreds of mysterious shapes have appeared in crop fields. Some people think that these are merely elaborate hoaxes, while others claim that they reveal a secret message, a desire by other life forms to communicate with us. Supposedly, plants gathered from some of these crop circles had significant changes in their DNA structure. Some people have even succeeded in filming the creation of one of these extraordinary shapes. If these films are real, then the crop circle phenomenon deserves a place of honor in the field of extraterrestrial activity. Over the years, the UFO phenomenon has become such a large forum that we find hundreds of cases where the link with unidentified flying objects is more intellectual than factual. Such is the case for the cryptids, strange creatures, whose appearance in our world has been recorded in incredible reports. In 1990, Puerto Rico became the hunting ground for a predator that seemed to spring right out of a Lovecraft novel. The creatures primarily attacked small livestock, sheep, chickens, and goats. The dead bodies were drained of all blood. Hence the creatures were dubbed the chupacabras, which literally means goat sucker. Witnesses report that the 5-foot-tall creatures looked like gargoyles, with bat-like wings, sharp claws, and huge, bright red eyes.
Well, the chupacabras really is, if, whatever reality it has, which is very questionable, but it's certainly more in the area of Forteana, really, or cryptozoology, than UFO. There is no direct connection to UFOs. It basically is supposed to be some creature of some kind. In fact, you do find similar type of creatures in the Fortean literature. For instance, the Jersey Devil, right near this area at the turn of the 20th century. You look at the drawings of the Jersey Devil, almost identical to the chupacabras. And it's supposed to be a very vicious creature that, chupacabras means goat sucker, right? And supposedly it attacks these animals and drinks their blood. It started in Puerto Rico a few years ago. Before that, even though if you go back to the literature in Puerto Rico, you do find in the 1970s, there was a serious man who was the founder of ufology in Puerto Rico, Lamarche, Sebastián Romiu Lamarche, and he was an architect, well-educated man. The foreword was written by Hynek. And he discusses many cases in the Caribbean. And among other things, he does talk about a wave that took place in Puerto Rico in the 70s of an entity that was known as the Vampire of Mocha. And the Vampire of Mocha is really the chupacabras, except that it's a little bit more sober, the drawing. It doesn't have as many fancy things. But if you look at the drawings, it's obviously the same creature. So something appears to be happening there anyway. But this whole thing got really carried away, and you had this incredible sociological wave, which you can trace it as it goes south. It starts in Puerto Rico, where it gets incredible promotion. Then it moves to Mexico, where again, thanks to people like Jaime Maussan and others, it gets incredible publicity. And then it starts moving south. And in Chile, it reached really grotesque proportions, where they claim that there was a nest of chupacabras, and this was all in like sensationalist websites on the internet, from Chilean groups and also from Chilean sensationalist newspapers, and they claimed the Chilean Air Force did a bombing, and they bombed the nest of the chupacabras.
I have spoken to many witnesses throughout Puerto Rico For a number of years running, I've conducted investigations there. I've spoken to people who've seen this creature, which has been witnessed by dozens of witnesses in some cases at the same time. It's able to fly, it's landed on their roofs and terrorized them. I think the most compelling witness I spoke to was a police officer of the Puerto Rican police who caught one of these creatures trying to kill his dog. And he shot at it point blank range with a .357 Magnum with a split end bullet. And those bullets do a lot of damage. It did not kill the chupacabras, but it certainly spoiled its day. Mm-hmm. So, and it left a lot of blood, and the blood samples were taken away by forensic experts with the Puerto Rican police. And I've had a lot of help in Puerto Rico by civil defense officials who led me to that policeman. So, as far as I'm concerned, this creature is real. I don't know where it comes from or what its purpose is, but it seems to be a blood gatherer. It seems its essential purpose is to gather blood and other internal substances from our terrestrial animals.
So that's basically, in brief words, I can tell you about the chupacabras. I think there is something, if you look at Vampiro de Moca, and also in Puerto Rico initially, there was some veterinarian reports, but beyond the original reports, the problem of the chupacabra wave is as it moves southwards, there was absolutely no forensic analysis. It was all media, eyewitnesses, in some cases eyewitnesses, there were dead chickens and things like that, but it could be explained in many various predators and so on, or perhaps not. But the problem is that they were not proper forensic. And when it comes to cattle mutilations or mutilations of animals of any kind, then you absolutely need forensic analysis of the carcass. Otherwise, you're not talking of serious research.
Towards the end of the 1990s, as the chupacabras were becoming more and more well known in UFO circles, although their link to UFOs was mostly speculation, another creature appeared on the scene. This new creature appeared in Virginia, a small village in Minas Gerais, about 180 miles north of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
I think one of the most important cases of the 1990s is that involving the creatures which were captured by fire department and military army officials in Varginha, Brazil, on January 1996. This has got a tremendous amount of witness testimony. Not only that, but many of the military witnesses have come forward and allowed their names to be used. Some of the medical personnel who handled the creature have come forward. It started one day in January 1996, and three witnesses actually saw a creature, a strange creature, cowering, apparently wounded or something, a very bizarre looking creature. Eventually, to cut a long story short, fire department officials came along, the army came along with nets to capture the creature. Another creature was captured elsewhere. They were taken away by the army to one hospital and then another hospital, and they were both given physical examination. One creature died and was autopsied. And the autopsy was conducted by Dr. Badan Palhares. Apparently, he has not allowed his name to be used, but I am convinced that he was the actual person who conducted that autopsy, and details have been provided. There are books published in Brazil on the subject, and I've published details in Unearthly Disclosure. An extraordinary case, really. You might refer to it as the Brazilian Roswell, if you like, but the difference is that it happened not long ago, and there are people prepared to come forward and talk about it. The official explanation is that it was caused by dwarfs. Yes. A pregnant dwarf couple and another dwarf who was shielding himself from the rain. So, to me, this official explanation by the Brazilian army is absolutely ludicrous.
Now, with regards to Varginha case, this happened, if memory serves me, around 1996. And again, is a case which, if you look at the raw report, the original report, it could be categorized as a close encounter of the third kind. Really, there were these three girls from a poor neighborhood of this city in Brazil called Varginha, who encountered this creature. But somehow, and that case might be true. These three girls, John Mack and many people later interviewed the girls, and everybody was convinced that they were sincere. They went in panic. They saw this creature, which was naked, and running around and so on. But then is when the story starts getting fantastic. So they call the firemen, and they go there, and they capture this so-called alien with nets and sticks. This is the most underdeveloped alien that I've never seen in the history of ufology. He runs naked, he gets captured with nets, he has no machinery, no uniform, no nothing. So even if something was captured, I believe it belongs really more to the category of cryptozoology. But because Roswell and Area 51 and all these myths were getting enormous exposure in the 90s, you start having Roswell cases in practically in every country. I remember there was a Roswell in Poland, even in Chile they came up with a Roswell and so on, but most of these were unsuccessful. But Virginia became very successful. And immediately from this C3 of the three girls, next you have a crash saucer with alien autopsies, with American Air Force, the whole package. But none of this part has been well documented to my knowledge. For some reason, I think the Brazilian ufologists were very eager to have their own crash saucer, and they really jumped the gun.
It seemed there was a whole zoo of nightmarish creatures wandering the earth, like the chupacabras and the Varginha monster. But what about the other oddities like Mothman, the Flatwood monster, and the Dover demon? The problem with all of the stories about unknown creatures is that they are supported by little or no physical proof. They form a series of more or less credible tales and reports. Unfortunately, there are no official documents confirming or denying the existence of these creatures. Neither are there photographs or credible films showing proof of their existence. When the Chupacabras attacks first began, Dr. Carlos Soto, a Puerto Rican veterinarian, confirmed that the livestock had been killed by a strange animal that was not a known local predator. Unfortunately, these analyses were never used in a subsequent investigation. For the time being, these creatures belong to the Zoo of Oddities. Each year, hundreds of livestock are mutilated in both the United States and Canada, and in some European countries as well. Obviously, most of these deaths are blamed on wolves, coyotes, and even birds of prey, such as buzzards. But behind the obvious cases, there are a series of mutilations that are not so easily explained. In some cases, animal parts have been removed, such as the anus, the reproductive organs, the eyes and the ears, and this appears to have been done with surgical precision. In several cases, especially those involving cattle, the animals were literally drained of their blood. These mutilations are so intriguing that some people are quick to blame them on extraterrestrials.
The whole animal mutilation phenomenon is very disturbing, and I've seen some very in-depth work that's been done, for example, by the National Institute for Discovery Science in America, with detailed forensic reports showing purportedly unusual cuts, perhaps made by a high heat source, such as a laser. There's apparently been a lack of predation with the carcasses, and some suggestion that the bodies have been exsanguinated. What all this means, I don't know. During my 3 years of work on the UFO mystery, I made contact with somebody in our Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food to see whether we were having cases like that here in Britain. There were a few suspicious deaths, but I believe that these were generally being put down to perhaps another mystery, the mystery of the big cats supposedly running wild in Britain. Lynxes, panthers, even lions, sometimes seen in the wild. And so any suspicious deaths were being put down to these factors, or indeed to just ordinary attacks by dogs. So this was never looked into as much as I would have liked. But it's an intriguing mystery. I don't know.
I personally believe that these animal mutilations are a very important matter and quite disturbing, like UFOs. It's been going on for a long time now, since the first case was reported in 1967, when a small horse was mutilated. There was an increase in this type of phenomena during the 1970s, with 1975 being a particularly rough year. Local authorities demanded an investigation. The FBI was not interested in investigating the matter and turned it over to a retired investigator named Rommel, who turned in a report stating that it was being done by birds of prey. But if we examine the matter more closely, we can see that his conclusions don't hold water, since some of the mutilations were extremely bizarre, as if the cuts were made with a laser. In one case, the skin was cut open along the entire length of the head. Birds of prey are not capable of doing that. Endless cases have been piling up, and rural residents are concerned. The occurrences have been primarily in the United States, but there have also been cases reported in Canada and in Europe, particularly Northern Europe, places like Scandinavia and Great Britain. This year there was quite a wave of mutilations in Argentina. Authorities tried to blame them on mice, but that explanation is far from credible and has met with serious protest from regional experts. One theory is that they're actually secret military experiments. I don't believe this explanation either. Why not? Because if the military had wanted to conduct secret studies, it would not have staged such frightening scenes for the public to discover. It would have been much more discreet. It would have procured the animals here and there and would have done the experiments discreetly in a lab. There's also a conspiracy theory claiming that these mutilations are done intentionally by the military to make people afraid of aliens. Why? According to conspiracy theorists, it's because the military wants to exploit this fear to gain power, to gain greater control over operations and over the population. I'm not totally convinced by this line of reasoning. The occurrences seem to be closely tied in with UFO sightings in the region. So unfortunately, I think that the matter is linked with UFOs, which would make it a more disturbing side of the whole UFO phenomena.
Unfortunately, despite its popularity, there is not much to support the alien theory. Some authors attempted to establish a correlation between the discovery of a mutilated cow and a UFO sighting reported in that area. But that's where the correlation ends between UFOs and mutilated animals. In fact, these coincidences, and there is no reason to believe that they are anything but that, occur quite seldom. If we consider the fact that animal mutilations date back to the late 1960s. Of all the theories proposed to explain the animal mutilations, the one involving extraterrestrials is the most unlikely and least documented.
I have personally only examined 2 or 3 cases myself, and I am puzzled. The ranchers and owners of the carcasses were very confounded by what they had seen. They did not have an explanation as to what had caused the death or the decay of their cattle. I'm not a veterinary pathologist, so I'd have to defer to one. And when I talked with veterinary pathologists in Canada about what was being reported, it was their opinion that what was being seen and found were simply carcasses caused by natural decay, natural deaths, and perhaps some deaths by predators. They did not see a body of evidence. Yet, today, there's an excellent researcher by the name of Fern Belzile in Alberta who is a rancher of some repute and a very good investigator, a rancher who knows what happens to cattle. And he has seen many, many unusual carcasses and is convinced that there is something more to the cattle mutilation phenomenon than simply predators or natural deaths. As for myself, I still do not see a connection with UFOs, but I believe it's an interesting phenomenon that is probably worthy of study, but I would like to see more veterinary pathologists get involved, because at this point most of the people investigating cattle mutilations are UFO researchers without a background in veterinary pathology, and it is those people whose expertise I believe would have the ultimate authority.
Another theory proposes that it is the work of small groups making animal sacrifices, but this theory must be rejected. In general, satanic cults that make animal sacrifices tend to use small animals like cats, dogs, and goats. If the mutilations are being done by humans, we have to look elsewhere, not in these cults. Could it be part of a vast secret operation orchestrated by authorities? To even give this theory a second thought, we would have to entertain several speculations. For the purpose of this exercise, let's imagine that agents working for a covert branch of the government are performing complex tests to study the behavior of certain gases to prepare for future chemical or germ warfare. These gases would be dumped into the air. Then, a few days later, a commando of specially trained forces would show up to remove skin samples from livestock. This scenario, which borders on paranoia, may not be as wild as it appears. We recently obtained secret documents from the archives of the FBI, which state that some of the livestock were found with high doses of the insecticide atropine in their blood, which is a tranquilizing drug. Another report suggested that these mutilations were being done to test the effects of vitamin B12 or other toxins in the lymph node system. As compromising as this speculation may seem, the documents appear to point in one direction. Interestingly, in its official report released to the press in 1980, the FBI, who had been contacted by the governor of New Mexico to examine the mutilation problem, concluded that they were essentially the work of predators. There was no mention of toxic substances found in some of the dead animals. But if it was done by agents working for the government, why would they be using farmers' livestock? Wouldn't it be more discreet for them to use government property and animals? These are a few of the questions that remain unanswered at this time. Questions such as these will no doubt continue to generate wild conspiracy theories. In the early 1980s, a new odd phenomenon captured the interest of UFO groups: crop circles. At first, they were described as circles of different sizes, found early in the morning in fields of growing crops. The plants had been flattened without the stalks having been broken. Some claimed that this was proof that they were not a hoax. Oddly enough, the phenomenon seemed to be happening only in southern England. Then, while scientists were trying to come up with models to explain how mini tornadoes could produce such an effect, the crop circle phenomenon took on a whole new dimension. Instead of circles, fields would be marked with geometric shapes that became more complex over time. It could no longer be discounted as a natural phenomenon. Whatever was behind these shapes, it obviously displayed a great ability for transformation and a high level of intelligence. In 1991, while some people were seeking a secret message behind these shapes, a news item was released that shocked the world. Two retirees, Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, said that they were the ones who had started the crop circles. They had supposedly made their first crop circles in the late 1970s using a board attached to a rope. The press had not mentioned it at the time. Once several crop circles were created, the media became interested and spread the news. As is often the case with this type of story, Doug and Dave's confession did not convince the entire world. What's more, those who believed that there was a higher meaning to the crop circles were quick to point out that the two retirees were paid close to $2,000 for their scoop.
One of the sort of new faces of the UFO phenomenon in the 1980s onwards was the emergence of crop circles, particularly around the slopes and the hills of the southern England, around Warminster indeed, where the British UFO stories were born virtually. And of course they were then reported in other countries, and indeed right across the world they've been reported. It's a very popular phenomenon. It's actually made its first movie in Signs recently and so on, and it has been quite well investigated. I've spent 2 or 3 years investigating crop circles all over southern England and so on, and indeed in Sweden when I was working in Sweden with a Swedish researcher. What I think is important about crop circles is that there was a belief that a crop circle could not form naturally. And there are still people who say, well, the crop is bent in a way that it grows in a certain way that's not like a simple mechanical pushing and so on. And there seemed to be that kind of evidence. Then there were some tests, and particularly by a BBC, a chap in the BBC here called John McNeish, who went out with the people who had confessed to hoaxing a lot of crop circles, Doug and Dave, they were known as. He went out with them and he challenged them to do all the things that the crop circle believers said couldn't be done naturally. He said, can you do a straight line for 1/4 of a mile? They did a 1/2 a mile. Could they do this? Could they do that? And the fact is that whether crop circles are being done in microwave energies or UFOs, test beds or whatever else, the fact is that these people could create perfect crop circles.
If it was nothing more than a series of hoaxes, then how did the perpetrators get into the fields without leaving a trace behind? Mystery lovers enjoy questions such as that. Between 1989 and 1994, a small group of French investigators called the Northeastern Committee of Ufology Groups, or CNEGU as it was known, visited southern England repeatedly to study the crop circles. The researchers did not take long to find a human explanation for the phenomenon. Gilles Munch found no mystery in the lack of traces near the crop circles.
La plupart des centres des cercles, c'est toujours valable à 2000.
Most of the centers of the crop circles can still be seen in 2003. Most of the circle centers were on tractor lines, but a small percentage of them were outside of tractor lines. How could these tractor lines be reached to make the circles? We were convinced that the circles were being made in a pragmatic fashion by perhaps 2 people holding a rope. They couldn't do anything until they reached the center, and they had to walk carefully through the field. It's been proven on film that if a person takes precautions, he can walk across a field without leaving a trace. But after several crop circles were made, we noticed that people were no longer taking precautions. They were walking on the crops. People were rushing to get to the center of the circle, leaving traces behind them. Once at the center, they could design the shapes as complex as they wished. In fact, we found paths left by these people in wheat fields that we thoroughly examined. Well, we call them paths. Someone has walked through the field, 1 foot in front of the other, and has trampled the stalks 2 inches around the center area. But the center area is long, and we need to find the starting point. There is only one radius, and it lies hidden under the flattened crops. If we don't look carefully, we can't find it. Apparently, no one was looking, and as soon as we began, we would find the radius. It got to the point where we were able to judge where to look before even entering the field. I'd say we are accurate about 95% of the time. I've never calculated the statistics. The times that we didn't find it where we expected to, it was usually a bit off to the side. It was a random variable that led to this error in logic. From then on, there were hints other than the paths, but they were the most revealing.
First of all, with crop circles, I first looked at a ring or patch of vegetation associated with a UFO report in Canada in about 1975. This was long before crop circles were commonly referred to and found in England. In fact, in England they did not start until about 1980-81. But I was not at all impressed with some of what I had seen. In fact, over the years I have personally caught or had confessions from people who had made some of these circles. for their own purposes as a lark to confound and puzzle people. Although in the early days, in the early 1970s, there were some very intriguing cases in Manitoba and Saskatchewan where objects had been reported to be seen landing and taking off and leaving behind patches. Now we just simply see these rather elaborate formations most often in England, and the assumption is that they are somehow related to UFOs, but very, very few cases are reported. I would tend to think that these are two very disparate phenomena. The cases where an object is seen to land and take off and leave behind a patch, as opposed to a crop formation, very elaborate, very, very difficult to make mathematically perhaps, but still possible to be made by hoaxers, because I believe the evidence is there that hoaxers are making the crop circle phenomenon around the world, not just one or two, but many, many, and many have admitted how they have done it. So I believe the crop circle phenomenon is not a real UFO phenomenon, if I can use the term real in that sense.
To prove that crop circles are an extraordinary occurrence, several people quote American biophysicist W.C. Levengood, who claims to have found significant differences between plant samples taken from inside of a crop circle versus samples taken from outside of the formation. Since he did not hide his conviction that crop circles are real, his objectivity and scientific methods have been questioned.
Some of the proponents of crop circles being something more than just pavement artistry or whatever, being some kind of truly paranormal phenomenon, have pointed to researchers such as those of Dr. Levengood, who have said that there is an actual modification to the DNA or the way that the crop is growing or some kind of effect on the crop itself. And that may be true, and it's not for me particularly to challenge him, but I would challenge the general claim, because I know from looking at some of the evidence that sometimes there is bad science in there. I'm not pointing the finger at any individual there, but sometimes there is bad science. For example, the people know where the samples are coming from. They say this is from a crop circle, etc. Now, true science on this nature should have double-blind tests. There should be crop that isn't from a crop circle, crop that's from near the crop circle, crop that's from inside the crop circle, which they don't know what they're analysing. And I've always remembered the story, which I'm not a biologist, but I think I get the general gist of it, which was that when they were studying the chromosome count in the human genes, in the human cells, that there was a belief that there was 48, and then there was a belief that there were 46, and scientists would actually get the microscope out, look at the chromosomes and count them, and they counted 46, and they were sure there was 46, and then someone said, actually no, if you count them there's 48, and when they counted them all again they found there was 48. Even scientists see what they want to see sometimes, and they get blinded to the things that they can miss. And I think crop circles, very few people have started out totally neutral. Those people that you go to analyse your sample usually are sceptics who want to prove that they're nothing, or they are believers who want to bolster the proof. And there hasn't been, in my view, good scientific analysis of the samples from crop circles, and if there were, I don't think that there would probably be a great deal of difference between the samples themselves, because I don't think crop circles do have an exotic story. But with good science, we could either prove that there wasn't, or we could prove that there was, and then I'd have more faith in those claims.
In the past, and sometimes now as well, we can detect flaws in the crop circles, now that we've gotten used to looking for them. If it were truly an extraordinary phenomenon, or one that reflected an intelligence above that of human beings, we would expect to see shapes that were geometrically perfect, which is not the case for most crop circles. That's my first point. My second point is that using basic human technology, nodes and flattened stalks are feasible. It would be much more disturbing to see fields where the stalks had been bent at the top only, not at the base. That would be a lot harder for humans to do. Or instead of flattening all of the stalks in the same direction, why not intertwine the stalks as they are flattened? That would also be very difficult for humans to do, especially using basic technology. Or instead of flattening the shape of a crop circle, why not flatten the rest of the field and leave stock standing to create a design? To be beyond human technology, we would have to imagine things that were very much more difficult to imitate, which would leave no doubt as to their mysterious origin, without making it clear what that origin might be.
These days, there are fewer and fewer defenders of the possible exotic origins of crop circles. Human techniques are so well known now that it appears more and more improbable that they are extraterrestrial in origin. Even films supposedly showing the creation of crop circles by small balls of light have been revealed as clever hoaxes. But if they're nothing more than hoaxes, what motivates people to create them?
Notre conviction était qu'il s'agissait, à ce moment-là,
We're convinced that it is land art created by artists who made these shapes in the fields just for fun, as a sort of challenge, a competition perhaps between groups with different lines of thinking. The fact that there are different types of shapes and different designs, which are like a trademark signature, leads us to believe that there may be a challenge between different groups of people, perhaps schools, since we figured that students are the sort of person who might be likely to do something like this. Making a crop circle doesn't require much time, so it could be done during school holidays. A certain knowledge of geometry and math are required, as well as a logical approach to organization. You don't need a very high level of education to be able to make a crop circle. You just need the right education. In England, challenges between schools are quite popular, so it follows naturally that crop circles might be land art competitions between artists.
Since the confessions of Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, other artists have come forward. These teams of crop circle builders, such as the Bill Bailey Gang, Merlin and Company, and Spider-Man and Catwoman, are now well known by the British press. In November 2000, one of these artists, Matthew Williams, a computer technician, became the first crop circle creator to be fined for having damaged a field. Proof that fame has its price. Off the U.S. coast, bordered by Bermuda, the Florida Peninsula, and the island of Puerto Rico, is a vast expanse of ocean where hundreds of ships and aircraft have mysteriously disappeared. It is known as the Bermuda Triangle. It is said that this area has been the site of inexplicable occurrences for centuries. Navigators dating back as far as Christopher Columbus claim to have seen extraordinary lights in the sky. Sailors have also seen strange lights below the sea, referred to as USOs, unidentified submarine objects. The most famous disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle happened on December 5th, 1945. That day, a squadron of 5 Avenger bombers took off from the Fort Lauderdale Air Force Base. The squadron was to fly east, bomb an old ship hulk anchored off the coast of Florida, and return to base, a routine exercise. At around 3:40 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Taylor, leader of the squadron, informed the base that he seemed to be lost and his instruments were not functioning properly. He added that he believed he was over the Florida Keys. Controllers tried desperately to lead the squadron back to the ground. Eventually, they lost radio contact. Search operations began around 7:30 p.m. in the belief that Flight 19 had probably run out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. As if the loss of the squadron was not enough, the seaplane sent out in search of Flight 19 exploded off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. The final count for that fateful day, 27 men disappeared and 6 aircraft were lost, 5 Avengers and 1 Martin Mariner. The U.S. Navy concluded that Flight 19 had disappeared due to pilot error. No wreckage of this legendary squadron was ever found. What became of those aircraft and the men aboard? Mystery lovers interpret the events that occurred in the Bermuda Triangle as proof of extraterrestrial activity.
One thing associated with UFOs quite a lot is the so-called Bermuda Triangle mystery, which is that an area of land and sea, mostly sea, just off the Bermudan, off the west coast of America, off the near Bermuda, has a huge amount of ship and plane losses that happen there. And the first thing to know, I mean, it has been studied by many people. In fact, almost my namesake originally, a chap called John Wallace Spencer, known relation of mine, studied it a great deal. And if you like, the sceptical side studied by a chap called Lawrence David Couche, who brought a book out on this as well. And the one thing that does become apparent is that the Bermuda Triangle, if it's nothing else, is also a statistical blip. There are more planes and boats running around in that area, and there is undoubtedly losses because there are inexperienced people with boats. It's a millionaire's playground. The Coast Guards have reported people trying to run around with world atlases when they should have very detailed maps because they can come to harm with shifting sandbanks and so on. Plus you have a high incident of drug running and so on, where ships are captured and then sunk afterwards, etc. So the Bermuda Triangle may not be any more special in terms of the amount of planes and losses than anywhere else. That said, within the Bermuda Triangle, and it has to be said in other parts of the world, but there are several in the Bermuda Triangle, very, very strange stories. One of, or several of which I think might be explained by the looking now at the release of methane gases, which actually makes the water supportive, and suddenly you become non-buoyant in the water, and ships could literally just sink because they're in this kind of huge methane gas release. And more studies need to be done in that, but there's been some very good science on that. Probably the most famous report in the Bermuda Triangle is, however, I think, one of the true mysteries of the world, and that is that Flight 19 got lost and was never seen again. I mean, they haven't really been found since. They have found a lot of these types of planes under the Bermuda Triangle, in the sea, but in fact they were used for bombing raids and things, so they haven't found those planes. Effectively, a flight of planes went out, seems to have got lost. They were in contact all the time with their base. They said we can't. They were describing that the sea looked wrong, the sky looked wrong. They were changing direction here, changing direction there. They were never seen again. They were an inexperienced crew, although their leader was an experienced trainer and should have been able to get them back to base safely. It's possible that they could have just got lost and eventually run out of fuel and dropped in the sea. And were that the only part of the mystery, that would be enough. But what then happened was that, having created a fuss in the first place, they then sent out a very experienced rescue crew in a Mariner flying boat to go and find them. And that never came back either. That almost certainly exploded and was destroyed. And that, I think, is a coincidence too far. That really does need some more explanation. One possibility being, of course, that there was some huge, genuine electromagnetic surge that was messing up all their compasses, etc., and eventually even triggered the gas tanks of the Martin Mariner, which was known to be a bit unstable in terms of its safety and so on. But that means that there was an unusual discharge of something going on in the triangle. And that, for me, means that whatever the statistics on the triangle are, and I actually don't think the triangle is quite the mystery it's made out to be in that way, but there is something strange happened then, has happened on a few other occasions in the triangle, and it may be that there is something really, some kind of, maybe a meteorite under there or something in that area which actually does have an effect occasionally.
There is a huge myth surrounding the Bermuda Triangle, which has been perpetuated by best-selling novels such as those written by Charles Berlitz. People wonder where ships and aircraft go when they disappear, especially the famous squadron of 5 Avengers that left Fort Lauderdale in 1945 and disappeared. And then the seaplane that was sent out to find them disappeared also. That leads some people to believe that they have gone into another dimension, or perhaps they are trapped in time. One explanation is that UFOs are behind the mystery. There is also a theory about a time portal. And of course, there's always the possibility of whirlpools sucking them underwater. It's an unstable area. UFO researchers claim that not only are the pilots and sailors being abducted by aliens, but also their aircraft and ships. In the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, we see the Avengers reappear in the desert at the beginning. and then the pilots return at the end. So I think that this film only served to perpetuate the myth, since we also see a ship in the Gobi Desert at the beginning of the movie. The only clear link between UFOs and the Bermuda Triangle is the fact that UFOs have been spotted over the Bermuda Triangle, like so many other places. But the Bermuda Triangle holds a special place in the hearts of mystery lovers, due to all of the disappearances that have occurred in that area.
A century ago, Charles Fort, a New York journalist, began gathering stories about extraordinary occurrences, such as tales of raining frogs, mysterious disappearances, unexplained objects in the sky, unknown creatures, and much more. Charles Fort became the first person to document the world of mystery. In his honor, strange occurrences are now referred to as Fortean phenomena. Fort understood that the world is sometimes a stranger place than we may think, whether or not they are related to UFOs. The oddities documented by Charles Fort continue to fascinate readers. The universe is infinite, not only in terms of time and space, but also what can be found within. It has a multitude of unknown laws and inexplicable facts. The endless stories of oddities only go to prove this.